Hey, this is Leo for actualized.org. And in this episode, I'm going to be talking about understanding how paradigms work and this very sneaky phenomenon of paradigm lock. If you want to experience massive growth quickly, and you want to get to the root of most of your issues in life, then you really need to study and understand how paradigms work and this phenomenon that I call paradigm lock. This is a very in-depth episode, a very foundational episode. We're going to cover one of the most important topics that you can possibly understand for understanding all of life is this notion of paradigms and paradigm lock. So stay with me. It's going to be a little bit abstract at first, but by the end of it, you'll see a lot of practical applications, and this is some very mind-blowing stuff. So first, let's talk about what a paradigm is. In the second half of the episode, we'll get to paradigm lock and what that phenomenon is. So what is a paradigm? The definition of it would be something like a philosophical or theoretical framework of any kind, including all of the assumptions and ways of thinking and ways of interpretation that one might have. So think of a paradigm as a self-contained view of reality, like a lens, a colored lens that you look through. Except the trick with paradigms is that they don't feel like they're just a view of reality. They don't feel like they're a lens. So most of the time, you're not aware that you're in this view, and you're not aware that you're using a lens. It just feels like reality. We call it reality. We don't call it a view. We don't call it a model. We don't call it a framework. We don't think of it that way. Our mind just sees it as reality. And you can see how this leads to a lot of self-deception possibilities, which is why it's very important to study the mechanics of paradigms, which is what we should explore right now. So it's interesting because this word paradigm has become quite popular in common vernacular, but this only happened recently. In 1962, Thomas Kuhn, who's a historian of science and a philosopher, he published a book, a revolutionary book, one of the most important works of philosophy in the last 100 years, called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And this was groundbreaking stuff. And it was based on a very simple investigation. The investigation, you would have thought that we did this hundreds of years ago, but apparently no one did this until Thomas Kuhn came around. What Thomas Kuhn did is he just said, hey, you know what? I'm interested in understanding how science works, the process of science. What is science? How is it that it works? And rather than doing what most philosophers and scientists have been doing for hundreds and thousands of years now, which is that they were speculating and theorizing about how science works, what he did is he said, you know what? Let me take a historical perspective. Let me actually take a look at how science has evolved over the last 1,000 to 500 years and see what the history actually tells us. Maybe the history of science tells us something other than what we assume science is. Maybe it can reveal some interesting stuff. And he found some very interesting stuff, which has revolutionized how we think about the theoretical foundations of science. Some of the stuff he found was rather shocking. It shocked the philosophical community and the scientific community. And from that, we got the word paradigm in our common vernacular. He popularized the term because his work was so groundbreaking. So what did he do? Well, he studied various scientific revolutions. For example, the Copernican revolution in science, the Einsteinian revolution. He studied Newton. He studied various scientific, more minor revolutions that you probably haven't heard of in chemistry and in other aspects of science. And he looked at just basically how does science evolve and what do scientists actually do on a day-to-day basis? And then what kind of changes lead to big breakthroughs in science? So he studied all that. And what he discovered is that science is a lot more conservative than people usually think. and that in practice, science works very differently than we think of it in theory. In theory, we like to put science up on a pedestal and we like to say, well, science is this sort of ideal. It's this ideal process of investigation, this empirical, fact-based, very objective investigation into the nature of reality, which yields certain indubitable truths. And sure, there's fallibility in it, but generally, science operates on this kind of higher level, which transcends petty human biases and culture and all that sort of stuff. But when Thomas Kuhn went through the history books and he actually studied this stuff, what he discovered is that actually no, science is highly subject to dogma, to cultural biases, and to clinging to old frameworks. And this notion shocked the scientific establishment because scientists like to view their work and the whole process of science as very objective. They like to view it as a universal process, not a human process, not a cultural process, but universal, so that it's not even the human species engaged in this work, but something even higher. We're tapping into really universal truths with the scientific method. But what Thomas Kuhn discovered is that that's not how it works at all. In reality, most scientists are very closed-minded, very dogmatic, and very traditional. And he found 4 basic ways in which paradigms influence an inquiry. One is that they influence what is studied and what is researched. So depending on your paradigm, whatever your paradigm is, in whatever field you're working in, that will influence what things you study and research. Seems kind of obvious. Secondly, it influences the type of questions that get asked at all. Thirdly, it influences the exact structure and nature of the questions that are being asked in that field. And fourthly, the paradigm influences how results are interpreted. So when you go and you run a science experiment, you get some data back, and usually we just assume like, well, data is data, right? Everyone agrees on the data. Not so fast. What Thomas Kuhn discovered is that actually the data, the interpretation of data, this is a much trickier affair than we normally assume. And here is where your paradigm, your entire framework of the world or your field will heavily influence how you interpret the data. Which data do you think is relevant and which is irrelevant? You see? I'm going to add 2 additional points to how paradigms influence inquiry. One of my points is that the paradigm shapes what is allowed to be possible and what is imagined as possible. And this is a very big point. So depending on what your paradigm is of biology, chemistry, physics, reality, or whatever field you're working in, your paradigm tells you what is and isn't possible in that field. And it also determines how your imagination is going to work and thinking about various possibilities. There are certain possibilities that you won't even imagine from within your paradigm. And this is where the paradigm becomes very constrictive, because you can see how if your imagination is crippled and your ability to think about the possibilities is crippled within your field, how much that will limit your possibility to make new discoveries. And that's exactly what Thomas Kuhn found, is that most scientists aren't outside-the-box thinkers. They're very traditional. And what they do is they just go through a very routine process of collecting data within the established paradigm of their time and of their culture. And only rarely do we have scientific revolutions where somebody like Newton or Einstein or Galileo comes along and flips a paradigm upside down on its head. That's very rare. Most scientists are not working like that. And the reason that these revolutions happen is because most of the time, 90% of the time, the regular scientists, the majority of them, are just working to collect data to validate the existing paradigm. And this leads to certain phenomenon that I call paradigm lock. I'll talk more about that as we go on. Another bonus point that I want to give you here about how paradigms influence inquiry into the nature of reality is the assumptions that are made by the paradigm and the things that the paradigm takes as self-evident. What's interesting about paradigms, whether they be scientific ones or religious ones or spiritual ones or secular ones or economic ones, and I'll give you lots of examples of paradigms coming up here in a minute, is that each paradigm takes things for granted and makes assumptions about what is self-evident to that paradigm. There are certain things within mathematics, for example, the paradigm of mathematics, that are taken as self-evident. Certain things within science, certain things within religion, certain things within economics, and so forth. And this notion of stuff being self-evident, man, this ends up being something that comes back to bite you really in the ass. This notion of self-evidence. This is something you can see how this notion of self-evidence allows the mind to get away with basically anything that it wants to get away with. This opens the doors for self-delusion. That's a problem when you want to do an inquiry into the nature of reality. So the way that science works is we have long periods within science of gathering data inside a paradigm, and then short, rare periods of overthrowing the paradigm. The way that a paradigm gets overthrown is when enough anomalies get collected through the ordinary scientific process that finally the existing paradigm becomes untenable and it has to be rejected and somebody has to come up with a radical new scheme. And then once someone comes up with that, he usually gets a Nobel Prize. He gets a lot of credit, but only after his work has been subjected to a lot of skepticism, criticism, denunciation, and even demonization and rejection. So that's the really interesting thing, is that most scientists are extremely closed-minded. And only after the fact, after the entire paradigm has evolved and went through that critical period of transition, and only after the revolution has completed itself, only then do we look back in retrospect and we say, oh yeah, that was obvious. You know, Albert Einstein's work in overthrowing the Newtonian mechanical paradigm, that's obvious stuff now. It wasn't obvious then. And Galileo overthrowing the old paradigm of the sun orbiting the earth, it's obviously silly now. That's so easy for us to understand, but back then it was no joke. It was a life and death matter. So we have to be very careful about not taking history for granted. Another point that Thomas Kuhn made about paradigms is that paradigms are a real mind-bending thing because he said that paradigms are incommensurable, which means that when you have two strictly different paradigms, you can't necessarily translate from one paradigm into the next. These paradigms, you can think of them almost as isolated bubbles. There's a bubble here and a bubble here. There's a way to interpret reality this way, and then a totally different way to interpret reality this way. And it's not always easy to communicate between these two different bubbles. And of course, there can be way more than just two bubbles. This he called incommensurability. Now, he was actually later challenged on this because people went and looked at his work and said, well, incommensurable, is it really the case that one paradigm can't be translated into another paradigm? Is it really the case that when you're in a paradigm that you are in like a totally different reality, in a sense? That's what Thomas Kuhn wanted to say at the extreme. But some people have reeled that back and said, no, paradigms aren't really like that. We can interpenetrate paradigms. So that's a more complicated issue, which I'll leave for another day. Maybe if I do an episode on the philosophy of science, that's where you would really get into that stuff very deep. But what I'm interested in here is taking this notion of paradigms and now showing you the enormous implications that they can have for personal development. Because I'm not just interested in coming up here and giving you interesting philosophical theories. That's well and good, but we're interested in application here. So let me give you a list of paradigms so you are clear about what I'm talking about with this word. And then we're going to get into paradigm lock. With paradigm lock, that's where the application happens for personal development. So stick with me here. Here's a list of paradigms. I want to give you a big list so you're really clear about how significant this stuff is. This really affects all of humanity, all social systems, all scientific endeavors, philosophical endeavors, and your personal life. So here are some very traditional examples of paradigms. Ptolemy's heavenly spheres model of the universe. So this is a 2,000-year-old theory, comes from Ptolemy, which is the notion that the heavens are made out of these spheres and everything is rotating on a sphere. The Earth is at the very center. So it's this sort of Earth-centric model of the universe, and that the stars are on these spheres. Sounds silly nowadays, but back then, 2,000 years ago, it was really considered the best model. The Platonic forms paradigm. So Plato, if you've studied him in philosophy class, then he had this whole notion of these abstract forms that were like the essence of reality, and that our sense perceptions aren't the essence, but that these Platonic forms are the essence. So that was a paradigm, a sort of framework, a lens through which you saw the whole world. And you interpreted everything you saw through that lens of Platonic forms or heavenly spheres. When you actually looked up into the night sky under Ptolemy's model, you would actually imagine and see those spheres in a sense. They weren't visible, but your mind just kind of filled that in, right? Because our minds are very conceptual. Also, from the classic era, we have teleology. Teleology is the idea, which has really gone out of favor nowadays, but this idea that objects and things in the world have a purpose. For example, there might be examples from ancient Greeks or Romans, like philosophers, and they would say, well, the purpose of a horse, what's the purpose of a horse? Well, the purpose of a horse is to carry man or to carry load. That was its teleological purpose. Or the teleological sort of purpose of an acorn is to become an oak tree. That was its purpose. And that has kind of been abandoned. But that was an interesting way of looking at objects. You looked at them purposefully, like the purpose of a pencil is for you to write with it. And this was seen as something very essential, almost like inherent to the fabric of reality, is that all these different objects have these baked-in purposes. Kind of interesting way to look at the world. Atheism versus theism is a paradigm. There's the atheist paradigm, there's the theist paradigm. The no-God paradigm versus the God paradigm. There's the paradigm of Euclidean geometry and non-Euclidean geometry. This is very interesting. This is actually something that then affected Einstein's work, in that he had the brilliant idea that maybe space is curved, which means that space is not Euclidean, but non-Euclidean. And that was made possible by the discoveries of non-Euclidean geometry, which was a huge paradigm shift that happened just 100 years prior to Einstein's time within the field of mathematics. Whereas for the past 2,000 years, most people assumed that the only kind of geometry that was possible was straight-lined Euclidean geometry, until we discovered that, hey, there are complex surfaces beyond just the plane. There's the sphere. There can be spherical geometry or hyperbola geometries, which really opened up the doors. That took a paradigm revolution, paradigm shift. The paradigm of Newtonian physics versus Einsteinian relativity, we've already alluded to that, but that was a huge paradigm shift and came from two totally different ways of looking at the world and seeing space and time in very different ways. The naive realist paradigm. I've talked about this in a separate episode about naive realism. The naive realist paradigm basically is the notion of reality that people have of an external reality, a three-dimensional spatial reality, a reality made out of matter, atoms, molecules, and so forth. That's a paradigm. But notice that you think that that's how reality is if you buy into that paradigm. You don't think of it as a paradigm. You think of it as reality. the paradigms of rationalism versus empiricism versus idealism. If you studied philosophy even a little bit, then you should be familiar with at least those three basic paradigms. Those have been themes throughout philosophy for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Mathematics itself is a paradigm. And within mathematics, different fields of mathematics, from calculus to statistics to number theory to topology, they are also containing different paradigms. Karma and rebirth is a paradigm. Comes from a lot of Eastern traditions where they have this whole paradigm. They see life as just this never-ending cycle of rebirth, death and rebirth, death and rebirth, death and rebirth, a soul, this immutable soul that goes through this infinite process of rebirths. And karma is playing a big role in that. That's a whole paradigm. In the West here, we generally don't think of life that way. Two different ways to think about life and death. Consciousness as brain activity. That's a paradigm. You probably think that consciousness comes from your brain. That's a paradigm. That's not reality. That's a paradigm you have. The trick with paradigms is that you're not conscious that you hold paradigms. That's why they're so sneaky. Quantum mechanics is a paradigm. The modern cosmology, the notion of the universe as a big bang that's expanding and inflating, that's a paradigm, as contrasted with a static universe, is how we thought about the universe just 100 years ago. We thought the universe was static until we discovered that it wasn't. Logic and rationality are paradigms. You better believe that's a paradigm. That's not a given at all. That's a paradigm that you're using. In philosophy, logical positivism is a paradigm. Darwinism versus intelligent design, those are two different paradigms. Scientology is a paradigm. Capitalism versus communism, paradigm. Liberalism versus conservatism. How about pickup? Are you into pickup? Have you noticed how much pickup is a paradigm? It's a huge paradigm. One that blindsides a lot of people. Because most people who do pickup get into it, they get into it for sex. They get into it for ego. They don't usually know about paradigms. They usually haven't studied epistemology or philosophy, so they're not aware of this stuff. And they get really sucked into that paradigm of pickup. And they see the whole world through this lens of pickup. And that becomes quite a trap for them. Success-oriented self-help is a paradigm. All the self-help material that promises you to attract wealth and cars and houses and yachts and just this whole notion that you're developing yourself to improve your life, that's an entire paradigm of personal development. There are totally different paradigms. You don't have to be developing yourself for those reasons at all. It's interesting that once you can see that as a paradigm, you can literally walk down the aisle at a bookstore and just walk through the self-help aisle, and you can see shelf after shelf after shelf of books that are just all within that one paradigm, that are missing a lot of other elements. Of course, there's spiritual-based self-help, which is another different paradigm, and there could be crossover between those two, but often they tend to occupy different shelves in the bookstore. That's interesting because the people who are into success-oriented self-help oftentimes poo-poo the spiritual-oriented self-help, and the people who are into the spiritual self-help, they poo-poo the success-oriented self-help, because these people occupy different paradigms, different bubbles, so to speak. Freudian psychoanalysis is a paradigm. It's gone out of favor nowadays. There's also Jungian psychology, which is a paradigm. Cognitive behavioral therapy is another psychological paradigm. There's a lot of paradigms within psychology. There's Gestalt psychology and many, many others. If you study psychology, you can get into all those. And then you can compare and contrast which paradigms you like better, which are more effective at solving your problems. Entire cultures like Islam or Hinduism becomes a paradigm. Buddhism becomes a paradigm. Of course, all the religions are paradigms. Eastern versus Western medicine is a paradigm. A lot of Western doctors are not aware of the fact, even though they have spent years, decades studying the medicine, they're not aware that they are operating within a Western medicine paradigm and that there are limits to that paradigm, very real limits. Western history is a paradigm. A lot of people study history for 10 or 15 years, all through high school and middle school and elementary school and in college, and they recognize that that history is all shaped by paradigms. Modern academia is a paradigm. The university system and how it works, that's a paradigm. Conspiracy theories are paradigms. Astrology is a paradigm. Vegetarianism versus the paleo diet versus some raw food diet versus some sort of food combining diet versus some sort of like low acid diet. All the different diets you see on the bookshelves at stores, well, those are all coming from different paradigms too. And you can see how paradigms compete with each other. There's paradigms within the paranormal. There's occult paradigms. Shamanism is a paradigm. Witchcraft is a paradigm. Voodoo is a paradigm. Postmodernism is a paradigm. Relativism is a paradigm. Realist art versus impressionist art versus post-impressionist art versus abstract art versus postmodern art. Those are all paradigms that evolved within the history of art. And if you actually study the history of art, it's very interesting because there's dozens and dozens and dozens of artistic paradigms. Very interesting. And this whole notion of being avant-garde, being on the leading edge of the paradigms within art, that in and of itself turns into a paradigm. Very interesting. Behaviorism is a paradigm. Spiral dynamics is a paradigm. Phrenology, measuring people's skulls and then correlating that with their intelligence, that whole science, which has now been debunked, that was a paradigm. Homeopathy is a paradigm. Thermodynamics is a paradigm. Even within technologies, within just practical technology, we have paradigms. We have the PC desktop and mouse, the graphical user interface. That's a whole paradigm. Someone had to come up with that. Touch screen mobile devices, that was a paradigm. Really created by Apple. In fact, both these paradigms were really pioneered by Apple to a large degree, and then they were co-opted by a lot of other companies and pushed forward. These were very successful paradigms, which have, had huge social ramifications, have had huge economic ramifications. And the last one I'll give you is the paradigm of building your career by going to school, getting educated, going to university, getting a 4-year degree, and then going into the marketplace. That whole mode of educating our public, our kids go through that whole process, and then they become young adults and they get a job. That whole paradigm, that's just a paradigm. That's one way to do it. There's many other possible ways that we could educate our children to become good and qualified for their jobs. For example, in the old days, we had guilds. In the medieval times, we had guilds. We had apprentice programs where you would go and you would live, a child would actually live with a master. Like if you think about Michelangelo, he would go as a child, live with a master for 10, 20 years and learn to be a sculptor rather than going to some university. Maybe that was a more effective model. I'll let you decide about that. But anyway, so these are all the different examples of paradigms. Now let's talk about paradigm lock, because this is where the application happens. So this is just a word that I came up with. And what it means is when the mind gets stuck in a cohesive and circular framework, this sort of bubble, until it's not able to break out because it's committed to only using that framework to do all its interpretation and data collection. Do you see what I'm saying here? So here's the crux of the matter. Here's why paradigms are so dangerous. Is because once you get stuck into a paradigm, you get nice and comfy with it. Now all of a sudden you're not open to exploring new perspectives. You're not open to acknowledging that you're inside of a paradigm. You're not open to the fact that you are adopting one perspective out of potentially infinite number of perspectives. You're not opening to questioning the self-evident assumptions that your paradigm makes. And you place the burden of proof on others to convince you, demanding that they explain everything to you through your paradigm and your paradigm only. This is a common trap, for example. Well, every paradigm basically falls into this trap, but I especially see it, for example, with rational people. When you have a hyper-rational person and you want to discuss something like spirituality with them, and then you come to them to have a discussion, what they will want you to do, and they won't even realize that this is what they're asking you to do, is they'll ask you to take all your spiritual insights and to reformulate them so that they all make perfect sense within the rationalist paradigm. They will ask you for proofs, for logical arguments. They'll ask you for no paradoxes, no contradictions. They'll want double-blind studies and this and this and that. And what that is, why that's dangerous, is because to not get locked into a paradigm, you need to be able to step outside of your paradigm. But what someone in a paradigm does is they don't realize that when I'm in this bubble, for me to really appreciate the next bubble, what I need to do is I need to step out of this one and fully immerse myself into that one. And the danger that people make, and this is what paradigm lock is that they're in this bubble and they say, okay, I'm in this bubble. Now, there's some stuff in those other bubbles, but I don't recognize my own bubble as a bubble. My bubble is reality. So those bubbles, that's like some stuff I could explore, but it all has to be interpreted only in my model of the world. Because my model of the world is not a model of the world, it's reality. And this is where you get locked, right? You get locked because now you're committed to using those self-evident assumptions that you made from the very beginning that you weren't even conscious of. Now you're committed to using them to interpret everything else. But you know what? Those other bubbles, what defines a bubble is the collection of self-evident assumptions and other premises and attitudes that one has. So to fully appreciate all the other bubbles, you have to be able to say, okay, I'm in a bubble too. Let me not kid myself. I'm in a bubble too. And if I really want to appreciate the other bubbles, I gotta step out of my bubble, leave behind my frameworks, leave behind all the old analytical tools that I had, and really dive into this other bubble and to see it from its own position, rather than interpreting it into my old paradigm. This is where the issue of incommensurability that Thomas Kuhn talks about becomes significant. It really is the case that you can't translate across every bubble. Or even if you are able to, something is lost in the translation, which is often what happens between rational and spiritually minded people, is that the rational person will really insist that all spirituality be boiled down into rational arguments. And even if we attempt to do that, you might get some value out of that, but the essence of spirituality will be missing because you refuse to take the burden on yourself to step outside of your bubble and really go and explore this totally different domain. It's almost as if you're sitting in a city like, let's say you live in Los Angeles, and you heard me talking about New York City. And you would say, yeah, you know, this New York City sounds very interesting. I would like to experience it, but please bring it here to Los Angeles because I am too lazy to get on an airplane and to fly to New York. That would be a huge inconvenience for me. So Leo, please bring New York City over to Los Angeles and then I will enjoy it. And you can see that that's an absurd position, right? You can see that that kind of person isn't really serious about inquiring into the nature of reality. He doesn't really want to explore the world. Yeah, he's willing to entertain certain new experiences, but only on his terms. So if I take a snapshot of the Statue of Liberty and I mail you a postcard of it to Los Angeles, you can look at that picture and be like, oh yeah, this is pretty cool. And you might think that, oh, okay, I got it. I know what New York is all about just because I looked at this postcard of the Statue of Liberty. Or maybe I looked at a postcard of some other, like Central Park or something. You might think you got it, but you haven't really got it until you've gone there and seen it for yourself, because the Statue of Liberty looks very different in person than it does on a postcard, you see. So you have to be willing to travel a bit. And when people are not willing to travel, that's when they're in paradigm lock. And this is what we mean by closed-mindedness. These are closed-minded people. And make no mistake that many scientists, many mathematicians, many philosophers, many of the most intelligent people on Earth and throughout history have succumbed to this trap of paradigm lock, and they didn't even realize it. As simple as it is, right? This isn't rocket science, but it is tricky stuff. Some of the simplest stuff can be some of the trickiest. The problem is that when you do research only within your paradigm, based on your assumptions and the stuff you think is self-evident, then of course, it shouldn't be a surprise that you open yourself up to the bias of confirmation. This is called confirmation bias. Why is that? Well, because your paradigm is a collection of assumptions and frameworks about how reality is. If reality ends up being different than what you thought it was, and you are always interpreting everything in a way to accord with your paradigm, then what's going to happen is that you're going to leave anomalies on the side. There's going to be all this anomalous data that you're just going to ignore, and you're saying, no, that's not relevant, that's not important, that's all just, noise. It's all noise. And you're only going to confirm what you were looking for. And you're never going to really take seriously the stuff that you weren't looking for. This might work if reality was very orderly and intuitive. That might work. But as hopefully you've already seen through all the different episodes that I release, one of the most common themes in every episode almost, I tell you, this is counterintuitive, and that's counterintuitive, and this is counterintuitive. Look how counterintuitive all this stuff is. So if we live in a counterintuitive reality, then adopting a paradigm in a rigid fashion, that's going to cause problems. That's a big potential blind spot. The trick with paradigms is that they're so all-encompassing and wide that they tend to block our imagination from imagining alternatives to the paradigm. It seems like when you're inside a paradigm that this is how things are and that they couldn't possibly be any other way. For example, you might say, well, Leo, what alternative is there to rationality and to logic? Or what's the alternative paradigm to mathematics or to science? All the other paradigms, they're just kind of hokey and they don't even compare in quality, right? Wrong. That's a failure of your imagination and a lack of your experience. To get the experience, though, you first need to have the imagination. So when your imagination gets crippled by a paradigm lock, this is a very dangerous thing because you close yourself off from new experiences, radically new experiences. You are underestimating the degree of radicalness and counterintuitiveness possible with new experiences. That's because your paradigm is so all-encompassing that you can't see it. You're like a fish in water. Without experiencing the alternatives, you get stuck in your mind. You get trapped. And without experiencing alternatives, here's the real tragedy. You won't even have a desire to experience alternatives. This is the problem that happens when someone lives in a village his whole life. And he's lived in his little village for 50 years, and then you tell him, hey, let's go travel to Hong Kong or to London or to Australia. And the guy's like, no, I'm staying in my village. This village is the best thing that there is. And you tell him, no, how do you know the village is the best thing there is? Because I love this village. I've lived here for 50 years. Of course it's the best thing there is. And then you tell him, well, but what about Australia? Maybe it's better there. And he's like, Australia? Don't be silly. Look at this village. This village, I have 50 years of experience with this village. Australia, that's nothing. See, he doesn't even desire an alternative. The more alternative, radical perspectives you experience in life, the more open your mind becomes. It's a sort of exponential growth effect. It snowballs. After a certain point, you reach a critical point where you start to realize that it's all just a collection of perspectives. And that clinging to any one perspective is very small-minded. It's very short-sighted. The more certain you feel about a paradigm, the more you set yourself up for a mind fuck. Because the more certain you are about your set of assumptions and how the world is, and the world ends up being very radically different than that, the more you cling to your little position, then the bigger the upset will happen. You see, you're setting yourself for surprise. You're setting yourself up for pain. And you're putting yourself into a position where you're going to have to play the ostrich. You're going to have to stick your head in the sand. Because otherwise, the pain of admitting that you've been wrong is going to become harder and harder and harder as the years go by. So you're going to have to get very good at denial and mental gymnastics. And so now you can see why so many people are so good at denial and mental gymnastics, and why the world is generally in a state of deep ignorance, and why spirituality can't penetrate into mainstream culture. Exactly because of this problem. The funny thing about paradigms is that you can construct semi-self-consistent and self-referential bubbles that make sense of the world or some limited pocket of the world. And you can construct millions of these, right? This is how cults happen, how religions happen, how mainstream cultures happen, how languages happen, how universities happen, how governments happen, how corporations and hospitals happen. All of these are like little bubbles. And if you take a cosmopolitan big picture perspective, you see, hey, there's thousands upon thousands of bubbles that humankind has invented. Could I be living in one of those bubbles? Or am I outside the bubble? Or am I just kidding myself that what I'm in is not a bubble? When you really take seriously the possibility that you're inside a bubble, just like most other people are, that's real progress. That is the opening of your mind in a permanent way. Very few people get there. A lot of people like to think that they're there or that they're getting there, but they're not even close to getting there. So when you have all these self-consistent bubbles, the problem is that they really feel complete when you're inside of it. It really feels like you're inside your own little universe, you know? If you were living in Amish country and you were Amish, that little bubble of Amishness, you would feel like that's the whole universe. That would feel to you like the greatest thing ever. And if you were a Scientologist in that bubble of Scientology, you would also feel like that whole universe is like, that's it. That's the truth. That's the ultimate thing. That's the most meaningful thing in life. And same thing for everything else, including science, including mathematics, including your government type, including your economic preferences, whether you're a liberal or a conservative or any of that kind of stuff. See? And the problem is, when you've explored a lot of these bubbles, you have to ask yourself, well, which bubble is right? Which bubble is best? It's very easy to say that your bubble is right and best when you've only been in one or two bubbles. It's a lot harder when you've been in 100 bubbles. You start to really scratch your head and wonder, I don't know. I don't know which of these bubbles is best. Is it possible for me not to have any bubbles at all? And then when you reach that point, now you're really getting into true spirituality. But that's tricky. That's very tricky, because as soon as you think you're out of a bubble, usually you're just right back into a new bubble. A little bit bigger bubble, right? Because you could have bubbles within bubbles within bubbles within bubbles. How do you break all the bubbles? Is that possible? Well, if you want to answer that question, you got to get really serious. A lot more serious than you are right now about epistemology, about metaphysics, about non-duality. That's a topic for another time. What I want to just point out for right now is that all bubbles have blind spots. And the reason that is because they make assumptions about reality. And all assumptions you make about reality end up being wrong. They end up being wrong and limiting in some fashion. So here's the thing I want to point out. This is really interesting. I was thinking about this the other day. And you see, the reason this is interesting because you see this all across culture. Anything that's outside of your paradigm or your culture's paradigm, it's always dismissed. And it's dismissed in very classical, predictable ways. So here are all the ways, I'm going to list them out to you. This is like a complete list of every excuse-making mechanism that a paradigm uses against other paradigms. Because see, to maintain a little isolated bubble of your reality or your view of the world, you have to exclude all the other ones, right? Because it's like this bubble is in a giant room with a bunch of other bouncing bubbles, and all these bubbles will collide and interpenetrate unless you have something that pushes on the outsides and maintains the rigidity of this bubble. And so, of course, every paradigm has methods. These are egoic methods that are used to dismiss the validity of exiting the paradigm and trying out other ones. So let's say I'm occupying the paradigm of atheism, or the paradigm of rationality, or the paradigm of materialistic science, or the paradigm of Scientology. What I'm going to do, because I'm sneaky, my mind is sneaky, is I'm going to demonize, in one form or another, all the other possible paradigms that are in competition with my own, right? And here's how I'll do it. I'll use labels to label the other paradigms. So I'll say that paradigm there is impossible or contradictory. It's logically impossible. It's contradictory. It's paradoxical. See, once I attach those labels to a new paradigm, that means I no longer have to take on the burden of visiting that paradigm and exploring it. I no longer have to take that one seriously because obviously it's contradictory. And that one's obviously impossible, so that's a waste of my time. Here's another tactic I'll use. I'll say, that one over there is insane. That one's irrational. That one's deluded. That one is foolish, and that one there is naive. Here's another set of labels I'll use. I'll say, that one there is criminal. That one is treasonous. That one up there is heretical. That one down there is dangerous and harmful to our children. And that one over there, that one is antisocial. Here's another set of labels I'll use. I'll say, that one is weird, just downright weird. That one is comical. That one is ridiculous. That one over there is a fantasy. It's fantastical. That one over there it's too abstract and philosophical. It's not grounded. It's not realistic. Another set of labels I'll use is, that one over there is useless. It's just totally useless. I wouldn't have any use for that in my life, even if it was true. That one there is just unimportant. It's not important. That one there is a waste of time. Waste of my time. Why should I travel to New York, Leo, when that would just be a waste of my time? Why? There's nothing I could possibly learn from that. I already know, because I'm already very familiar with Los Angeles. I'm so familiar with Los Angeles that I know that I'll never find anything of value in New York. So I just won't even go there. It's just a waste of my money, a waste of my time. Why would I spend 6 hours flying across the country, all the way to go to New York? Why? And here's the most devilish of the excuses. That paradigm over there, I'll call it demonic. That one, I'll call it satanic. That one is occult. That one is evil. That one is just downright offensive. And that one over there is outrageous. I'm sure your mind could come up with even more labels and ways that you dismiss other paradigms, but this is a pretty comprehensive list. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to think about what paradigms you occupy. What are your favorite paradigms? Whether it be scientific ones, rational ones, theistic ones, religious ones, economic ones. And I want you to notice how you and your friends, all the people who occupy your little bubble, how you like to demonize and dismiss in all these different ways all the other perspectives. And what this practically accomplishes is that when you make these judgments, these are really prejudices, right? This is the definition, textbook definition of prejudice, is when you judge something without having actually experienced it. So you judge Christianity without actually having been a Christian. You judge Buddhism without actually having become a Buddhist. You judge Scientology without having been a Scientologist, you see. Now, of course, you're going to come up with an excuse and you're going to say, well, Leo, why should I become a Scientologist? That's just a bunch of bullshit. You want me to waste my whole life exploring all these bullshit ideas and all these bullshit paradigms? But if you don't, you're prejudiced, you see. So one option there would be to reserve judgment and to say, well, I don't know. I've never been a Scientologist, so I truly can't judge Scientology. Because the only way I could really judge Scientology would be to step inside that bubble. Have I been in that bubble? No. I have only heard stuff about Scientology, which seems kind of negative the way it's portrayed a lot of times, from within my bubble, to be honest, right? I've never become a Scientologist or a Christian or a Buddhist for that matter. But nevertheless, I judge them. But how do I judge them? I judge them from my bubble. I don't actually step into their bubble. What you'll find though, and you feel free to test me on this one, you don't need to just believe me, go enter the bubble of any one of these paradigms that I'm talking about, and you will see that it looks a lot more appetizing and a lot more reasonable and a lot more sane than you thought it was when you were judging it from outside, from your paradigm. Right? This applies to Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, science, and all the other stuff that I'm mentioning. So let me now give you a set of examples of paradigm lock, because that's what we're talking about here. Christianity has a big component of paradigm lock. And you'll notice that every paradigm has a mechanism that ensures that it locks you into it. Usually, very rarely, is there a paradigm that says, hey, go explore all the diverse paradigms that exist. That's extremely rare. That is actually antithetical to the point of being a paradigm. The point of being a paradigm is to lock you into its scheme. And of course, to effectively lock you in, it has to blindfold you so you don't see anything outside of it. So Christianity, you argue with a Christian and you start to make rational arguments to a Christian, the Christian will then say, oh, well, but the Bible contradicts that. And then you say, well, how do you know the Bible is correct? Well, because the Bible is the word of God. But how do you know that's true? Well, because it's written by God. But how do you know? Because God wrote it. See, it becomes a circular argument. And then you can't really argue with these people because they take that as a self-evident assumption. That's part of the Christian paradigm, is that the Bible is indisputable, right? That's taken on faith. Now you might say, well, Leo, I'm above that. I'm an atheist. Oh, watch out, because here's the atheist paradigm lock, right? You should argue with the atheists, and the atheist will presume that there is no God. And they can't know this, of course, and they'll say that they can't know this, but what they'll do is they'll use some sneaky maneuvers, which are just as sneaky as the Christians' tactics. They'll use mental gymnastics to basically tell you that the default position is that there is no God. See, Leo, that's the default position. I don't need to be like a Christian because a Christian has to concoct gods. But an atheist, in atheism, it's just nothing. It's just the default position. I'm not concocting anything when I'm an atheist. But actually, atheism is a belief. And most atheists, of course, don't realize this. They don't recognize this because they're not conscious of it, that it's a belief. It is a position. They like to tell themselves it's not a position, but it actually is. And that creates a paradigm lock for them. And then, of course, when you tell them some spiritual truth, you talk to them about post-rationalism, for example. You talk about the pre-rational, post-rational fallacy that atheists commit with spiritual truths, and they'll deny that. They will be closed off to it. Because part of the atheist's paradigm is constructed in opposition to theism. So it's a sort of reactive thing, right? So they immediately have a sort of sore spot. They get triggered by anything that even smacks of the metaphysical or of the spiritual. And then, of course, that closes them in their little bubble. And they're really not better off than the the Christian is at all. Many philosophies that you find in the philosophy textbooks are like this. For example, Descartes' philosophy of dualism is paradigm locked. Descartes is paradigm locked. Logical positivism is paradigm locked. Empiricism is paradigm locked. Almost every ism is paradigm locked almost by definition. That's sort of its point. That's its hidden point. Another paradigm lock is naive realism, and I addressed that in a previous episode. Scientific materialism is a paradigm lock. The way that science is done in academia these days is very paradigm locked. Naive realism is the idea that there is an external world. Like, you actually believe there's an external world, which is not true at all, but that's part of your paradigm, and you interpret everything through that paradigm. And even when I tell you about it, you still can't shake it, because it takes an enormous effort to shake any one of these paradigms. Really, really serious amount of effort. Reductionism, as a theme in science, is a paradigm lock. Skepticism, the way most people abuse skepticism these days, that's a paradigm lock. The skeptic locks himself into his skepticism. See? The skeptic is so opposed to absolutism that he becomes absolute with his skepticism. It's really funny. All these things are just comical when you really look at it from a big picture perspective with some awareness. All this becomes a game. All these things that I'm talking about here are just a game. It's such a silly game, and it's so easy to see through the sham of it once you have become good at recognizing paradigms and paradigm lock, and then you free yourself to jump between perspective and perspective without being loyal to any one of them. Man, you can run circles around all these guys, right? And all these fields, all these paradigms generally have very intelligent people in them. There's intelligent Christians, intelligent atheists, intelligent dualists, intelligent naive realists, intelligent reductionists, intelligent skeptics, but their intelligence is really crippled by their lack of awareness. See, it doesn't matter how intelligent you are, when you don't have awareness of what I'm talking about here, your intelligence becomes a tool of evil to serve your ignorance, your lack of awareness. Because awareness is much, much more important than any degree of intelligence you have. Rationality and formal logic, these create big paradigm locks. Just take a look at all the academic logicians and mathematicians that you find in universities. They're paradigm locked. They can't think outside of formal logic and rationality. It's not possible to communicate with these guys. I've tried. It's funny. It's just funny. It's kind of sad too, because they're so locked into it. Thought itself is a paradigm, and it really locks you in, because have you noticed yet that when you're thinking, you lock yourself into this whole paradigm of thinking? Everything needs to be thought about. It's sort of like you're running around with a hammer and everything looks like a nail to you. That old adage. That's how thoughts work. That's how academics and intellectuals and philosophers really trap themselves. The fly in the bottle. What is that? It's thought. Thought is the bottle, because you're trying to think your way out of thought. And you can only get so far, because thought has serious limits. You can't get to truth through thought. But that idea is lost on most people who are deep thinkers. Of course, because the reason they became deep thinkers is because they were good at thinking, and thinking served them. And so now they want to solve everything through thinking, but they think they can't do anything other than think. Of course, that's false, but because they're in their paradigm and they're using their framework to interpret everything, then they will take any evidence or suggestion you give them about anything outside of thought, and they'll convert it into thought, because that's what a paradigm does, is it converts everything into its own language. And then they'll just say, Leo, look, it's just thought. You're just sharing more thoughts with me. Everything's a thought. To someone who's addicted to thoughts, everything is a thought, even stuff that's not a thought. That's the whole tragedy of it. That's what locks you in. Languages and the whole modality of using language to describe reality, that's a huge paradigm lock. The self. That's a mother of a paradigm lock right there. Yourself, the self, you as a human being are a paradigm. You're not a physical being, you're a paradigm. That's what you are. You're a paradigm. At least what you think you are right now that is a paradigm. And you're locked into it. And you can't imagine anything outside of you until you actually break out of you and you discover that there's something bigger than you, which is not a paradigm. But that's a topic for another time. Reality. That's a paradigm. And boy, does that one lock you in. What I'm saying, literally, is that reality, what you call reality, physical, the very fabric of reality itself, all of it, the notion that there is a reality at all and that reality is real is a paradigm lock. And you are so fucking locked into it that it would take a sledgehammer to your head to knock you out of it. Maybe not even that. How could that be? How could reality be a paradigm? Reality itself, the notion of a reality, that it exists, is a paradigm. But see, this doesn't compute in your mind because from within the paradigm of reality is real, this makes absolutely no sense. And that's right, because you really have to think outside you have to more than just think outside the box. You have to exit the box to discover that reality isn't real and that it's a paradigm. It was a paradigm the whole time. But how could you know that? See? So one thing I want you to do is I want you to start to notice all the people around you who are locked into paradigms. There's paradigm locked skeptics and atheists and theists and academics and scientists and capitalists and communists and economists and politicians and shamans and occultists and all of this. The list is endless. Most people are paradigm locked into many, many different paradigms. So start to notice that, although don't judge them too harshly because remember that you too are paradigm locked. So the point of this is not for me to give you weapons to go and now make fun of all your friends. The point is to notice the deep ignorance around you and within you, especially within you. The point of seeing the ignorance around you is to only deepen the appreciation of the ignorance within you. So how do we break out of these paradigms? Well, it's very difficult. Breaking out is very difficult. Very difficult. Because the mind is tricky and self-deceptive. Because of homeostasis. Because you're literally addicted to the paradigm. Your entire identity is entangled with it. So to break out of a paradigm requires that you actually give up portions of yourself. You have to bleed your own blood, in a sense. It's difficult because of pride, the pride you have in your paradigm. It's difficult because of fear, because of uncertainty, because of confusion, because of the humility. No, not the humility, the humiliation is what I meant. The humiliation that you will experience by having to admit that your paradigm has been wrong. See, that's scary. And then what does that leave you open to? A new paradigm. Going to a new paradigm is like going to a new country. You don't know what's there. You don't know if someone's going to kill you, rape you, murder you, steal from you. What's going to happen to you? You don't know. So of course you want to stay comfortable in the paradigm you already are familiar with. It's also difficult because of the loneliness factor. See, when you try to exit one of your paradigms, everything in your environment is going to work to keep you where you're at. All the people in your life, your family members, your schoolmates, your coworkers, and your spouse, so forth, they will not support you in breaking out of your paradigm. In fact, what they'll do is they'll pull you back in. They'll use all those labels and tricks that I told you about earlier. They'll say, no, that thing you're doing, Leo, you're pursuing enlightenment now. That's evil. That's dangerous. That's harmful. That's antisocial. That's insane. That's whatever, right? All these words will be used. Or like you talk about psychedelics with people, and what do? They immediately try to reject you and knock you down and pull you back into their paradigm. So they're living in a non-psychedelic paradigm. When you try to open them up to the paradigm of psychedelics, what do? They say, oh, it's just drugs. You're becoming a drug addict and this and that. You've lost it. You've gone crazy. You've gone down the deep end. You've lost it and boo, right? So all this happens. Isn't that interesting? And then, of course, that makes you feel lonely. If you're actually trying to break out, it's going to take you some while to break out, maybe months, maybe years to break out of your paradigm. But then everyone in your life is going to be pulling you back in. That makes it extra hard. And then, of course, there's going to be disapproval. They're going to disapprove of you. They're going to reject you. They're going to criticize you. They're going to demonize you. They're going to leave you. They're going to threaten you. Right? And all of that will go straight to your ego. And it'll go straight to the core of your deep psychological needs. And you will feel so hurt that you will fall right back into place. This is how you get disciplined into staying in your paradigm. You have to really want to break out to break out. And it's going to come with emotional labor and pain, some suffering. It's going to come with it. And at the ultimate level, the thing that stops you from breaking out of your paradigms is death and insanity. If you want to break out of the paradigm of self and reality, these are the two biggest paradigms that you're stuck in. You're going to literally have to face your own death and insanity to do that. How many people want to do that? Is that a comfortable, easy thing to do? Not for most people. Not ever. Ever are they going to be open to that. Never. So see, now you're starting to see why growth is so challenging. Because how can you grow when you're stuck in this bubble? How? Let me give you a list of the most important paradigms to break for personal development. This is the shit you got to break out of to really transform yourself. And what I will say is that if you don't break out of these paradigms, you're not even going to tap into 5% of your full potential in life. You can forget about personal development. Personal development while staying within these paradigms is just window dressing. You are not even touching the root of the issues. So here they are. Naive realism, which includes the belief in an external world, atoms, matter, and space. All of this has to go. It's a paradigm, and it's false. Rationality and logic, you have to throw that out the window. Atheism or theism, throw that one out the window. Science, throw it out the window. Persistent objects as existing. So when you close your eyes and you believe that the lamp still exists, the tree still exists, whatever, you have to throw that paradigm out. It's false. The self, you as a separate self, a self that is separate from the rest of reality, that's a huge paradigm. You have to throw that out under the bus. Life and death itself have to be transcended and seen to be the paradigms that they have always been. So you have to stop believing in life and in death. Language, the entire mechanism of language has to be seen as a paradigm and done away with. Thought, the entire mode of thinking about all of life and philosophizing about it and making abstract conceptual distinctions about it, that has to be put to an end and stopped. The paradigm of Western psychology has to be thrown under the bus because it's very limiting. Mainstream culture, all the entertainment, all the stuff you love about mainstream culture, whatever culture you're from, whether it's American culture, Islamic culture, Hindu culture, or anything like that, has to be discarded. Consciousness is brain activity. This is a paradigm you have. You actually believe that your consciousness comes from your brain. This has to be discarded. Psychedelics as chemicals. Thinking of psychedelics as just chemical activity, as just hallucinations, this needs to be discarded. Fear, thinking that fear is something that's real. This needs to be discarded. Thinking of problems as real. This is a paradigm. You actually believe that life has real problems in it. That's a paradigm you have. Needs to be dropped. The good and evil paradigm needs to be dropped. You actually believe that there's good and evil in the world. This needs to come to an end. It's a horribly limiting paradigm. The time paradigm needs to be really seen through, which means that you have to stop believing in the future and you have to stop believing in the past. And these have to be seen as conceptualizations for what they really are. So the time paradigm has to fly out the window. The success paradigm. holding your entire life as this process of achieving success, material success, buying a house, putting stuff together, building a great business, having a wife and kids, and going through that whole success cycle, that needs to be stopped. You need to see that that's a paradigm. Western medicine, you need to see that that's a paradigm. The paradigm that emotions are happening to you and that you have no control over them, that's a paradigm you have, which is false, that needs to be dropped. You, in fact, create your emotions. Suffering and pain as given things, that's a paradigm you have. You actually believe that your pain and that your suffering are real, that they are physical, and that they are inescapable, and that they are a core facet of life. That's a paradigm you have, which needs to be dropped. It's not true at all, but because you think it's true, it ends up being true for you, and it limits you severely. And finally, the paradigm that reality is real, the ultimate paradigm of paradigms, probably the most difficult thing to drop. You need to stop believing that this thing that you're occupying here, this reality, that it has any reality whatsoever. You need to recognize that that is a paradigm. So, to make these sort of breaks, to break paradigm lock, what this requires is a discontinuous jump. You have to jump from one bubble to the next. It's like entering a new universe, and you have to make sure that when you do jump from one bubble to the next, you don't drag your old remnants of the old bubble into your new bubble. That's going to fuck you up. That's the mistake people make, is that they jump to the new bubble, but they drag all other stuff, all their assumptions they want to take with them. They cling to it. That needs to stop. So what's really critical for you, the two key skills you need to develop from this episode, these are your takeaways. Firstly is the ability to spot when you are stuck in paradigm lock yourself. Of course, it's nice to recognize other people too, but that's easy. Yourself is most importantly. So that's ability number one. Develop that ability. Ability number two you need is to make discontinuous jumps, because once you recognize you're stuck, now you need to make a discontinuous jump, right? What are some examples of discontinuous jumps? Well, here's a few. When you think and reason so much that you finally come to a point in your reasoning where you realize that reasoning and thoughts will never lead you to ultimate truth. When you hit that point, you're ready to make the discontinuous jump into post-rationalism. Another one is that when you realize that reality is non-physical, that all of this is a non-physical thing. There's not a single physical thing about reality. When you realize that, that puts you in a totally different paradigm. Now everything you interact with, every human being and every object you interact with is no longer a physical entity. That's a huge, radically new way to see the whole world. Another discontinuous jump would be to realize that your emotions are something that you are doing and actively creating, rather than something that's just happening to you like a helpless victim. So that when you start to feel angry or pissed off or jealous or frustrated or depressed or any other emotion, or happy for that matter, you are conscious. In this new paradigm, you are conscious that you're creating that. See? You're creating that. You might not know how yet, but at least you know that you're creating it. That's a totally different paradigm than the way most people relate to emotions. Most people's paradigm of emotions is that emotions happen to them and that they need to escape from these emotions or repress these emotions, that they're good and bad emotions. You gotta exit that paradigm as quickly as you can. That paradigm is called hell. That's the hell paradigm. Another paradigm jump you can make is when you finally recognize that paranormal phenomena are real. So you will exit the regular scientific paradigm that there are no paranormal phenomenon into a new paradigm where there are paranormal phenomenon, and they're not even called paranormal anymore. They're just normal. Paranormal becomes the new normal. That's a jump you can make. So how do you make these jumps? Well, that's, there's only so much we can talk about here. This is a really deep topic. So I have to just gloss over some of this stuff. So yeah, let me give you some tips for how to actually break out of paradigms. So here are some different ways. Question assumptions very deeply. Get to the bottom of what your assumptions are about anything in life. Meditation, great technique for breaking paradigms. Self-inquiry and contemplation, also very powerful techniques. Psychedelics, the reason I'm so excited about psychedelics is because they will absolutely destroy all your cherished paradigms very quickly, very effectively, very rudely. That's why you don't like them. That's why you don't fucking like psychedelics. That's the only reason, is because they are so goddamn effective at breaking all your paradigms. That's why the government hates psychedelics too, is because they will fucking break the entire social matrix. All right, so you got to keep those away from the kids. Reading and research are important ways for how to break paradigms, because as you read and you do research, you open yourself to new perspectives. Traveling, going to different countries, interacting with different cultures is a great way to break paradigms, especially a lot of your cultural and social paradigms. Philosophy is a good way to break paradigms, although you got to be careful because philosophy, as you do it, you can jostle some paradigms, but also often you get stuck in bigger paradigms, so that's dangerous. This is challenging stuff. Really breaking down your paradigms takes a lot of work. It's not easy to do. It's emotionally laborious, but it does produce some of the biggest leaps in your own growth that are possible. This is going at the root of things rather than just doing window dressing the way that most self-help advice wants you to do. I have a worksheet for you that will help you to ground some of the stuff I've been talking about here and relate it to your specific life. So go click down below, download the free worksheet and fill it out. Make sure you do the worksheets. Those are very important. And I'm done here. In future videos, I will help you to tackle some of these very important specific paradigms that I just glossed over here. I will help you to break those down and show you all the hidden assumptions that come in those paradigms, with those paradigms, and all the danger that these paradigms pose to you and how they limit you. But for now, just stick with the worksheet. And that's it. I'm done here. Post your comments down below. Please remember to click the like button for me if you like this video. Share it with a friend. And lastly, come sign up to actualize.org right here. It's my website. Check it out. There's a newsletter there so you can stay tuned with future stuff that I release. There's a forum. There's a life purpose course. There's a book list. So there's good resources there to take you into this process deeper. It's not enough just to watch one of my videos or 10 or 100 of my videos, right? You got to be more serious with this work. Because the reason I love this work is because of the profundity and depth that there is here. The tragedy of it, though, is that the more deep and profound something is, the more abstract it is, the more work it takes to get to it, the more it can revolutionize your life, but also the less likely you are to do the work to get there, to get the results. So one of my biggest challenges is how to convince you to get on board with this process so that you go deeper and deeper and down the rabbit hole until you get to some really profound stuff. The most profound stuff you can't just get to by watching a few of my videos. But at the very least, what you can do is you can sign up and just stay tuned, make a commitment to this process of self-actualization. Self-actualization is not just a video you watch here or there, when you're bored at work or something. This is you recognizing that this is the whole fucking point of life. This is what life is about, is you self-actualizing. That's why you're alive at all. That's what you're here for. But most people don't recognize that. Most people think of life as just, I don't know what, they don't really think about it at all. They think of it as some sort of like, I'm going to grow up and have kids and then I'm going to retire and die. Or I'm going to work and then retire and die. That's that's sort of their model of reality. The whole point of your life is to self-actualize and then ultimately to self-transcend. But you got to get started somewhere. So I present content that's sometimes very deep for those of you who are down with that, but then a lot of you aren't down with that, so I have to present some more shallower content to get you interested so that at some point, eventually, maybe a year from now, 2 years from now, you can get into the really deep stuff. And then you will be so glad that you did. But for that, you need to sort of make a commitment to this whole process. One of the most important things that I did in my entire life is that when I stumbled upon self-help, and I only stumbled upon self-help when I was like 25 years old. Wasn't that long ago. Less than 10 years ago. Until then, I didn't even know self-help existed as a field. But as soon as I read my first or second self-help book, I realized that this shit is the thing that is really important in life. This is what's really worth putting my time and energy and money into. And so I did, and I made a commitment that I'm not just going to dabble. I'm not just going to read a couple of self-help books. I'm going to fucking master the shit out of this whole thing. And I'm still riding that decision. That decision I made probably close to 10 years ago, maybe less, 8 years ago, I made that decision. And I've been just working on that and chipping away on that. And the results I've been getting in my life have been phenomenal. And they just keep astounding me more and more and more every year. My growth is exponentially just like snowballing. And it's gotten to the point where it's just ridiculous. It's gotten to the point where I can't even relate it to you in words anymore. I want you to get there, but you're not going to get there in just 1 or 2 years. That's going to require a little bit more of a commitment. So you got to hold that vision that there's something bigger, something deeper, something very profound there that you will find for yourself. And it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter what kind of work you do or whatever. These are the core bedrock principles of all of life. And this stuff, nobody taught this stuff to you in school or at work or in your family. You didn't learn this stuff. Your preacher didn't tell you this stuff. Why not? Because all of this is threatening to the very paradigms that those people were a part of and that you were a part of, right? Their mission was to maintain those paradigms. And your mission as someone who's self-actualizing is to break the mold of all the paradigms and to discover reality as an absolute. And that is something that is not a pipe dream. That's actually possible. I've had glimpses of it, and let me tell you that it's extraordinary. So stick with me on this journey. Watch me grow and grow along with me. And I'll see you soon with more.